Today is about looking at what you've always seen and seeing it in a way perhaps you've never looked at it before. We're going to look at facilitation skills, presentation skills, communication skills that add congruency to what your intention is, while at the same time increasing the probability that what people perceive is actually what you intended. We're going to take a look at the choreography of presenting around the idea of the framework, the 7 essential abilities, based on the book that I wrote with Claudette Landry. And we're going to take a look at a book that has around 50 or 55 patterns that humans use that influence other people when we talk with them. We're not going to do 55 of those patterns today. We'll do a few of them. In fact, we'll do a few patterns for each one of the 7 essential abilities. And those abilities include, first, the idea of establishing credibility. And we'll get into what each one of these are as we move through, just setting the frame of what those 7 frames are. After credibility, we have the idea of establishing and maintaining rapport. And then after that, we'll take a look at the idea of how you can read a group, how you can look at somebody and have a sense of whether or not they're thinking or not, and if they're paying attention, and then some patterns about what we can do about that. And we're also going to take a look at how we can balance the task, the process, and also look at the group development as somebody in charge of a group when you are presenting, running a meeting. We'll also take a look at how to listen to and acknowledge someone when they're talking, and then at the same time move into the idea of how do you respond appropriately to that person. And then the last of the 7 essential abilities is called recovery with grace. And that's built on the idea of what do you do when things just don't go right. So we're going to take a look at these 7. And as we go through them, there'll be some patterns that we'll look at, maybe some skills you could practice on your own. And as you engage in looking at these particular patterns, think about the idea for you, what do you find maybe intriguing or useful that you would want to try on your own and then put into play just as soon as you can. So the first ability is around the idea of how we establish credibility. And as we think about the idea of credibility, we'll first identify it and define it. And credibility, as we look at it from a nonverbal standpoint, is the perception that a group has that at any given moment, whoever's talking is worth listening to. And yes, there's credibility in the sense of, how much you know, what your expertise is, what your status is in an organization, and those are all important. However, we're also going to look at it from the nonverbal standpoint, around those patterns that we can use that can contribute to that increase in attention that people can give you when you're speaking. And so one of the first patterns that you think about when it comes to credibility is going to be around the idea of voice tone. And as we think about our voice tone along a continuum, where one end is this idea of credibility, and on the other end is this idea of being approachable, they're not opposites and they're not exclusive of one another. The idea is that they actually can mix and match. We're just using this continuum idea so that we can talk about the idea of credible voice pattern and then eventually talk about the idea of an approachable voice pattern. So the approachable voice pattern is followed by several minor patterns underneath. And one of those patterns is to maintain your voice tone in a fairly narrow range. And the other thing is to be able to drop your chin at the end of any particular phrase. And so if you are talking to a group of people and you want them to believe that what you had to say is important, the easiest way to do that is to drop your chin at the end of each phrase. And if you drop your chin with really good timing, then people think what you had to say is important. And it's all timing. If you drop your chin too late, it looks really stupid. And if you drop your chin too soon, there's nowhere to go. So it really is about timing. And so the first of the idea of credibility is that voice tone. The second piece to this idea of credibility perceived by a group is along the idea of pausing. It's the pause that's that one pattern that so influences the metabolism of another person, changes their blood pressure, their heart rate, their breathing patterns. And it just increases the probability people will listen to you. Now, the idea of pausing is we have to make sure when we pause that we also include a gesture with that pause. And it's a gesture that when we do end up pausing, we don't move it. We can move our hands whenever we talk. It's just when we get up to the point that we're going to absolutely pause, that's when we hold it still. And you might have noticed at that point that you saw me breathe at the same time. The other important element in thinking about the idea of credibility is when we pause, we also want to breathe. And when we breathe, we want to breathe in a relaxed manner. And when we breathe down in the abdominal region, people perceive that as more relaxed. And if we breathe up here in the chest region, so it's that idea of pausing and maintaining that breathing at the same time with a gesture. In addition to those two pieces and using that gesture, it's the idea of having a stance of credibility. And there are several ways we can stand, and it's not that there's one right way or one wrong way. However, if we're ever standing in front of a group, running a meeting, presenting, facilitating, if you have a sense that a group's not attending to you, and you use a credible voice and a pause and a frozen gesture with low breathing, the other is that you want to have a stance that might increase the probability of people attending to you. And one way of having that stance is to just stand upright without a head tilt, because a head tilt's not very credible. So you keep the head up straight and your hands relaxed at your side. When we do that, people have a perception that you're credible. You can also use gestures that can increase that credibility when we're standing, and that is when your hand and your elbow are at the same altitude. It's the idea that they gesture this way, where this has a sense of credibility that is quite different than say that is, or that is, or any other pattern. It's that one. That's the one that contributes to a group's perception of your credibility. And so those are the patterns that make up, again, the idea of being credible, the idea of having people attend to you. One way we sort of measure the way whether this is effective or not is sort of deciding how people are paying attention, and that's eye contact. When people are attending to you, they're looking at you. They're not playing with their iPhone, they're not working on maybe email or some sort of document, or even side talking. It's the idea that they're looking at you. So those are the patterns for credibility, and that's the idea. We want to do that first. So when we open a meeting or a workshop or a facilitation, it's that idea of having credibility just right up front and setting the tone for what it is that you're going to be talking about. So we have the idea of credibility, and what we want to put in play now is the idea that voice tone gives people a sense of credibility, which is when you're sending information to people, when you're presenting ideas you would like them to, accept and believe. We also have a voice tone on this continuum where we use it when we want people to consider ideas, or we want people to put ideas in the room. We want them to talk. And so we want to increase our approachability, the idea that somebody would be willing to engage in the conversation with us. And the easiest way to add this sense of approachability with people is to add rhythm to your voice. Rhythm is it's a universal. It's like music. It's everywhere and people enjoy it. And when we put rhythm to our voice, it just appears more friendly. And the easiest way to add sort of this rhythm to your voice is to bob your head, like I'm doing right now. When we move our head up and down, we squeeze and extend the voice box, and that puts rhythm in our voice. And then if we have good timing, much like we did with credibility, if we have good timing and when we're talking to people, we lift our tone upward at the end of a particular phrase, that's when people have a sense of greater approachability. And the idea is you can't use it too often, because if you just constantly raise your voice at the end of any particular phrase, and you were to do that for several hours, it could be really irritating, probably like it is right now. So what we want to do is we want to be selective with that particular voice tone. And we'll do it naturally. You'll see people talk and do this. They'll say things like, "Are there any questions?" And that's a receptive, sort of approachable pattern, as opposed to, "Are there any questions?" In which case you're probably not going to get an answer over here. It's about getting the answer over here. So we can use that approachable voice. We can also increase our approachability to people by adding angles to our body. So if we tilt our head when we start to talk about things and we add angles to our body, this is just a lot more friendly with the palm up, space between the fingers, and it's curved. When we talk to people this way and we open it up, it just appears more friendly. Where if we take that space away, we take the curve away, and we put the hand like this, and we take away the head tilt, and we put the voice tone this way, it's entirely different. That this is a credible tone, and it's not friendly at all. So we can use those. Approachable, credible. Depending on your outcome, it's really up to you. So as you explore the book, at the beginning of the idea of credibility, you're going to read about a metaphor we use for music. And in music, there's always a familiar tune within a song, and it repeats itself. So if you listen to any contemporary music, actually any music that you'd like to listen to, there are patterns of notes in there that repeat themselves over the duration of the song. And it's a riff. It's much like in jazz, you have a riff that gets played out and expanded and compressed and varied. That riff in music is what gives it that familiarity and lets you know that all of this is related to the same song. So the idea of a riff, R-I-F-F, we're just going to reduce that to R-I-F and think about it in communication. Think about our riff. And all of us have a riff. It's that sequence of patterns that we have when we communicate that people recognize, that people see in us as being authentic and genuine. And we may not be aware of our riff, but people point it out. Yeah, have you ever gone to work, walked into the office, you didn't say anything to anybody, you just walk in, and then somebody says, what's wrong? Are you okay today? You haven't said anything. Well, what happens is they recognize your riff. It's off. And so usually what's off is our breathing patterns when we're not having a good day. Our breathing patterns off and kind of our posture's off at the same time. So people pick up on that really quickly. Well, what the RIFF, R-I-F, stands for is range, intensity, and frequency. Range, intensity, and frequency are in all of the patterns. So range is how large or how small something is based on a baseline. So you might stand in front of a group and deliver a workshop or run a meeting, and your largest gesture might be that big, and you really don't go bigger than that, where the elbow's about this far from the torso and your hand's up here. And then in that same meeting, your riff or your range of gesture might be really small. You might keep your elbow right next to you and gesture this way, or maybe even out that way. And what's important about the riff is that sometimes in a meeting this won't work, and so you try that and that won't work. And sometimes you need to go outside your riff in order to be of influence on the message you're trying to portray. So the idea is to begin to recognize your range of each one of these patterns. So another range is the idea of how loud you'll talk in a meeting. You might talk this loud, no louder. And you might talk this quietly and no more quietly. On the other hand, sometimes you might have to talk more quietly. Or even louder, depends. So it's understanding that range for each one of these patterns. Intensity, that's about speed. And it turns out that when we alter the speed off of our baseline for any one of the patterns, then groups begin to what we call hallucinate your emotional state. And what we mean by that is that if we gesture a certain way when we're talking, and we have our hands and our fingers curved and spaced and all of that stuff, people think a certain way. If we begin to move the gesture more quickly and up and down and like this, then that's completely different and people think you're having a different emotion. That's all, where all I really did was change the speed of my patterns and tone. But that intensity factor is what makes a difference. It captures people's attention sometimes. We just have to be careful as far as the idea of which emotion we tap. So thinking about the idea of how quickly you speak, or how slowly you speak, or how fast you change the pace of speech. Do you start up as a slow crescendo and start talking faster and faster and faster, and then eventually you're talking about as quickly as you could talk at that point? Or do you talk at a certain speed and then immediately you start talking a lot faster to make a point? Those are just intensity shifts. They influence groups. They influence people. Specifically, they influence how they pay attention to you. So if we recognize the range and intensity, then we can use it with some deliberate intention so that when we do want to communicate specifically and have it perceived a certain way, we could be more congruent with those patterns. So after range and after intensity, this last one's frequency. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's how often you do something. And if we do anything too often, it loses its effectiveness. And so we want to have a variety of tools. And that's why the book has about 50 or so patterns in it, so that you have a variety of tools. So you don't have to use every tool the same way and only have this gesture. Is that clear? Absolutely. So here's the next item. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. So we want to have that ability to have a variety of tools so we don't have to rely on anything with too high a frequency when we're working with a group. So we have now, in addition to that credible and the approachable, now we have this overarching concept of RIFF, range, intensity, and frequency. And then we can add that as we go through rapport and as we go through listening and acknowledging and responding and recovery with grace, how you can become aware of your range, your intensity and frequency of these patterns. And then as you choose to practice these skills and incorporate them in your work professionally, think about how you can expand the boundaries of each one of those patterns. Because all the patterns have boundaries, and the muscle memory we have within those boundaries tends to limit us. And sometimes that boundary is not significant enough to make an influence on people. So we have to build new muscle memory in order to know what it feels like to do a pattern that is completely different than we've done before. And at the same time, come across as genuine and authentic. As we continue to move through this framework of the 7 essential abilities, kind of as an overview, we've looked at credibility, and now where we're going to go is this idea of rapport. And rapport from a nonverbal standpoint is that sort of neurological connection that we have with people. It's that attention that we give with people, that connection that we have. And rapport can be replicated non-verbally. And what's nice about rapport is that, respectfully stating, we can get in rapport with a group, we can get in rapport one-on-one, even with small table groups. And as we look at rapport and that idea of being psychologically, neurologically connected to someone so that all of your energies are focused on what the person is saying and how they're communicating, and they in fact are back the same way on you. It's so powerful that sometimes we don't even hear the outside world when we're in really deep rapport with someone. You've probably had that experience. For instance, you've been at a restaurant and there's talking all around a restaurant and people walking around, and you're with the person that you're having dinner with, and you're just in a conversation. You're just really in tune with them, and every so often you'll realize, maybe you'll catch yourself and you'll realize you weren't paying attention at all to the outside world. You're just giving your attention to that person you were with. Well, that's the idea of rapport, and we can replicate that with certain patterns. So as we think about rapport, and this is going to be a description of it as opposed to an illustration of it, is that we want to be synchronized with the other person. And this synchronicity is what gives people the sense that we are connected. And synchronicity means that if a person is sitting a certain way in a chair, you're also sitting similarly to that. Not exactly like it, just real similarly to it. And the other thing is their tone, the way they speak. If a person is using a credible tone, and the other person will probably use a tone very similar to that. And as you think about how a person gestures, if you watch people, you can see it. A person will gesture a certain way, and within about 4 to 6 seconds later, the other person will gesture in a very similar way, a little different, not exactly the same, because that's kind of a mimicking or aping that can be really irritating. So it's a little bit of a delay in that gesture. Interestingly, if you listen to how people talk, the length of the sentence, the complexity of the words, the other person will often match and what's called mirror that also. In fact, a person will mirror all of those behaviors. And then ultimately, with the deepest of rapport, if you watch people that are in rapport, their breathing is synchronized. They're both inhaling and exhaling at the same time. And so as we think about this idea of rapport and ways to practice it that are described in the book, we can think about the idea that when we are up in front of a group, it's how do we get a group to do things perhaps synchronously? How do we get a group to do things the same way, the same time? It could be something like pointing at a PowerPoint slide or pointing to an easel and watching to see if everybody looks at the same time. And the idea is that if they do things at the same time, then they're a group. You have rapport with them. And what's important about rapport when we're thinking about professional settings is that rapport increases the receptivity that a person has to exploring new ideas. And these can be ideas that can challenge their knowledge and their skills and their abilities. And it can also challenge what they believe in and what they hold to be important. And when we do important work professionally, we want to impact knowledge and skills and abilities. We want to impact beliefs and values. And the idea is that when we get in rapport first with a group, then when we look at the knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we look at the receptivity, we bring them together so that people are more apt to consider ideas that might challenge what they know and challenge what they believe in. And that's really what training, meetings, facilitation is really about, getting people to consider what they might not have considered before. So that's the second of the 7 essential abilities around the idea of rapport. So we've gone through the idea of establishing credibility, the idea of maintaining, building rapport. We're going to look at now the idea of how you read a group. We're often in settings where we're with more than one person, so we've got many people in the room. And as we think about the idea of communicating, the idea of presenting, we are accountable for everyone in the room. And so we would like everyone to pay attention when we would like them to pay attention. We'd like to be of influence when we can be of influence. And people are just wickedly dynamic and unpredictable. And so the idea is, how do we begin to pay attention? And pay attention to what? So that when we're looking at a group, we know what responses we want from them. So there's a few patterns to look at from this idea of reading a group. One of them has to do with that idea of rapport, and it's the idea of synchronicity. So for instance, if we're in a group and we're doing a presentation or workshop or a meeting, and you say something like, let's look at this chart, if everybody looks at the same time, the group is synchronous. And in this model that we're looking at from communication, which has many anchors in not just linguistics and psychology, but also sociology, with lots of different authors that you'll see in the bibliography at the end of the book, that the idea is recognizing synchronicity in a group. If everybody looks at the same time, then in these models of group dynamics, the group's a group. They're all doing the same thing with you. There's a connection. In a sense, there's a rapport. If the group doesn't all turn and attend at the same time, then you have a split group, which can be incredibly challenging to work with. And if you say, let's look at the chart, and no one looks, they're actually still synchronous. They're a very strong group. They're just not attending to you. So you are in trouble. We'll get to recovery with grace when that happens. But the idea is that synchronicity is one of those elements that we can use to determine whether a group is with us or not. And so we look for synchronicity as evidence when we read a group. One of the other ones that you can think about using, if you would like, with adult groups, and we have to use it tenderly because it's a little bit of a K-12 model of teaching, is what we call echo. And it's the idea of, in the classroom, you might have had the experience where a teacher says something like, say this word after me, photosynthesis, and then the class responds photosynthesis. If they all respond at the same time, that is a symbol of connectedness and of rapport. It's something we use to read a group. With adult groups, we tend not to ask them to repeat things too much. So what we'll do instead is we might do something like turn to your neighbor and for the next 90 seconds have a conversation about this topic. If everybody turns at the same time, that's synchronous. If people start talking about the topic, we can think of that as the ideas of echo. They're on topic, talking about what they need to talk about. And so we can use that as a piece of evidence for that idea of echo responses. The other thing that we can look at when we think about reading a group is the idea of fluidity. And fluidity has to do with the idea that when you look out across a group, you could maybe use the metaphor of looking out across a field with tall grasses that are blowing in the wind. And when you look out across that field and see the grasses move, there's a pattern of fluidity there. Things are moving, not necessarily in unison, but they're all moving with some sort of connectedness. Just like water going down a stream, there's a fluidity to it. If we apply that idea to a group, fluidity has to do with when you look out across the group, people are moving. They're always moving a little bit. They're breathing, they're turning their heads, they're leaning forward or leaning backwards. It's looking at that fluidity that takes place. And when groups are fluid, it's kind of a nice place we'd like to have them generally, because we know they're breathing, we know they're comfortable. Where on the other hand, if you look out across a group and they're not fluid, they might be doing something like this. And that idea of holding your breath and not moving is a lack of fluidity. So we use that data so that we're talking in front of a group and we're engaged in the content we have. If we look out and suddenly we see that no one's moving and they're not breathing, then we don't have permission anymore to teach. We have to get a group to breathe. And so we have to do something, recovery with grace. We have to do something to get the group to breathe. And you'll discover in Recovery with Grace, that's something like just getting them to do anything, move, talk, whatever it is. So it might be for you leaving this space, going someplace else and talking. It might be telling them to turn, talk to a neighbor. Whatever it is getting them to do something so that they begin to breathe. The other thing that's important to look at in this idea of reading a group is how quickly they respond to you. And what we mean by that is that if you say something like, look at this chart, or you say something like, you have this many minutes, or turn to your neighbor, or stand up, whatever it is that you ask them to do, if they respond in a relatively short period of time, a second or so, then the group is not only well formed, the group is responding to you. If, on the other hand, you give one of those commands, turn to your neighbor, stand up, look this way, whatever it is, and they don't respond in a second or two. It's more like 3 seconds or 4 seconds, which can seem for some presenters an eternity, then you no longer have a group with you. You no longer have permission. You no longer have a group that is in a receptive mode to hear the work. So it's not a good place to be. Again, recovery with grace, you got to bring them back somehow. But the idea is that response times are something we can use to see how well the group is formed and how the group sees you as a presenter. And in a longer session than today's, there's a whole body of skills and work to explore along the idea of looking at that response time and the idea of whether or not a group should have a long response time, especially if you're doing a 3, 4, or 5 day workshop with them versus a short 1 hour, 2 hours. So there's all kinds of dynamics that we're not necessarily looking at today that influence this pattern of response time, and actually many of the other patterns too. Understand that we're just scratching the surface of a lot of these patterns. The other piece in looking at the idea of reading a group is how quickly you can get in rapport with them. And remember, rapport has those elements that we look at of mimicking or rather mirroring how someone's posture is and their voice tone, language use, and a few other things. We can also do that from the standpoint of looking at reading the group. So if you are working with a group where you have multiple tables around the room, how quickly can you walk to a table while they're doing table work? How quickly can you walk over there and get in rapport with the group? And then once you're done with that group, going over to another one, and how quickly can you get in rapport with them. So as you sort of gather the data of getting in rapport with different groups, it's that idea of always checking in. You're just always reading a group. And part of the reason that we're reading the group is because one of the philosophies, the belief systems that we have, is that our primary responsibility as somebody who stands up in front of a group is our safety. And when we talk about safety, we talk about that psychological safety. So when Daniel Goleman talks about that idea of downshifting and sort of activating the amygdala and a few other threat regions of the brain, the idea is we want to create an environment where adults are low in threat, emotional threat, and high in cognitive challenge. And it prevents that downshifting. It's what Renata and Jeffrey Kane call relaxed alertness. And that's huge for adults, because when we're working with adults, one of the things that is the challenge for us to set up in any learning environment is to establish an environment where adults are comfortable enough with their own discomfort at not knowing something and actually revealing what they do not know to others in the room. That's psychological safety. So these patterns, in addition to getting people's attention and helping people learn, these patterns also can establish that sense of having people comfortable with what they don't know and being able to share that lack of knowledge with other adults in the room. That's huge when you have a room full of professionals, oftentimes licensed, certified by states, by national organizations. They're professionals. And so here we are reading a group and at the same time keeping it safe enough for them to learn in front of each other. And so those are the elements that we can look at for reading the group. So this next ability is the ability that has, in my mind, most of the skills from the neck up and slightly to the left. It's really kind of a thinking essential ability as opposed to a nonverbal behavior ability. And it's around the idea of how we balance task, process, and group development. And the reason that this one's important is because when we are working with groups, and if our primary belief is the idea that we're responsible for the safety of the group, then as we think about the task, which is around the idea of the content and the work they're doing, and then we think about the process, which is how we're setting up the learning environment for people to engage in the task, then as somebody responsible for how people learn, we also have to look at the group's development. And how's the group doing? Are they functioning well? Are they in rapport with each other? Is there information being shared back and forth? It's a social idea that learning is a social event, and so by always attending to the group's development, it increases, the influence, it increases the learning. So when they're engaged in tasks and the processes for that task, we're watching the group. So we're doing the, read the group and rapport and all of those things. And at the same time, we're looking at task and process. And so with task and process, it's the idea of having protocols. For K-16, what we might call lessons, but when we think about it in a professional development setting, it's really about protocols. It's setting up the processes, the rules, the boundaries of how people will engage in the work that you want to engage them in. There's some work from Bob Garnson and Bruce Wellman in the idea of adaptive schools, and it's looking at what we call group member capabilities. And there are a series of group member capabilities that are worth teaching to a group. And it's the idea of acknowledging the goals that the group has and staying in tune with it. It's the idea of knowing, for instance, how you're being present. Are you being autobiographical just from your point of view? Are you being solution thinking as opposed to learning and only wanting to put ideas out? And the other idea is are you sort of listening to your own story and not hearing anybody else? And so you can explore the adaptive schools work for the group member capabilities. That's one of the elements for looking at group member development. So after looking at group member capabilities, next is the idea of what we call third point. And third point is a reference point in the room that's not between you and a group or you and another person. A third point is when you redirect a person to something else. It's not alive, it's not human, it's a screen, it's an easel, it's paper, it's whatever it is that you're going to redirect the energy and the focus of what people are attending to. And when we go third point, what we do is we break eye contact. And that's important because sometimes, thinking about group development, we want to give people permission to think. We want to give people permission to ponder. And for many of us, if not all of us, there comes times when we are thinking about something that in order to think about that, we actually have to break eye contact with someone. Look away. Think and ponder whatever the idea is. And when we're finished with that, we'll come back to the relationship. And so the idea in group development is that as we work with people, again, pushing knowledge, skills, and abilities, and perhaps new beliefs and values, then the idea is when we get to that, we go third point. And third point, we take the gesture and the eye and we move them at the same time to direct people someplace else. That idea of coordinating the eye and the hand is what makes the third point so powerful. For instance, if you did something like this and said, could you please look this way? And what happens is that people will continue to look at you. So the idea with third point is that we coordinate with the eye and the hand and move at the same time to redirect people. By having people look at something that's not human, an inanimate object in the room, we really do increase the likelihood that they're able to think, more so than if they just look at you. So third point is that other element when looking at this idea of reading a group. Another pattern that contributes to this idea of balancing task, process, and group development also comes from Bob Garmson and Bruce Wellman's work with adaptive schools, and it's around the 7 norms of collaboration. And in these 7 norms, it's the idea that they are normative behavior of the group. These are patterns the group has that help the group talk about what's important to talk about. And that's important because sometimes what's important to talk about is not comfortable to talk about. Yet if we use these 7 norms, and in addition, third point and a few others, it increases the comfort of the group because they're talking about that, they're not talking about that. And the 7 norms allow you to do that. And they include pausing and paraphrasing and putting ideas on the table and putting dialogue at the center and using data, presuming positive intentions. 7 of them to be exact. Getting those internally for you as a presenter, facilitator, instructor are important, and then working with a group to also inform them of that will contribute to that idea of balancing the task, the process, and the group development. There's one other pattern skill within this particular ability, and it's been labeled by Garmson and Wellman's work as a naive question. And a naive question is a question you ask not because you're naive of the information. A naive question is a question that is naive to the process. It's a check. It's a question of check, where are we? What are we doing? So a naive question could be something like, you're working with a group and you detect there's some tension in the room. And it's not productive tension at the moment. And not only is there tension, the conversation's also moved off topic of whatever the agenda said. And so a naive question, again, with the intent of group dynamics, would be, I'm curious, our agenda has this topic on it, and I'm just sort of wondering what it is that we're talking about right now and how that's connected with this topic. That's a naive question. It's an approachable voice, shoulders are up, palms are like this, heads tilted. When the question's asked, it's asked third point. So when people hear the question, they're not looking at a human, they're looking at an inanimate object. There's less aggression towards an object than there is a person. Helps people continue to breathe when they're looking at someone else, looking at another place rather. And so that's that idea of the naive question being for you, it's sort of like a way of doing a process check, of moving people through periods of discomfort. And it's not to say people should not be comfortable all the time. Of course, there needs to be discomfort and comfort in meetings. We need to be uncomfortable up here with our thinking so we can learn new things. It's just being able to recognize when that discomfort's just not productive and the group dynamic is not in a good place. So we can use that idea of a naive question to redirect, and third point can redirect as examples in this particular ability. And so those are the elements that make up balancing task, process, and group development. The fifth ability is called listen to and acknowledge. And it is focused around the idea that when we're up in front of a group, again, facilitating a meeting, doing a workshop, whatever it is, people are going to talk, and you're going to be listening. And the idea is we have to figure out what are the nonverbal patterns that we can use so that that person has a sense that they've been listened to and understood. And so we're going to look at it from sort of two different perspectives. One of them is the essential ability number 5, which is listen to and acknowledge. And then we're going to move into the sixth ability, which is responding to, in a sense, appropriately responding. So we're going to first listen and acknowledge, and then we're going to respond. So when you think about the idea of listening and the idea of patterns we can use so that when these are in place, whoever's talking feels like they're being listened to and understood, one of those is simply standing still when someone's talking. The idea that when you're up in front of a group and you're moving around and you're doing what you're going to do, when a person raises their hand and you call on them, you simply stand still. That gives a person a sense that you're attending to them. And you can imagine what it looks like if somebody's talking over there and you're looking at them and they're still talking, and then you start moving around. they're gonna get a sense you're not listening as much as you were before. So that idea of standing still is a huge, huge skill for letting that person know that you're listening and understanding. What's important about standing still is literally standing still. And we want to have our hands, relaxed, our arms at our side. You can certainly gesture and nod to a person, gesticulate, do all those things that are socially acceptable. The idea is that you're still. And what that means is that you're not doing this. And there are some people that when they stand still, they kind of rock back and forth or they shuffle their legs. There are times that gets in the way when someone's talking. So the idea is having the mindfulness and the consciousness of yourself so that when someone is talking, you literally can stand still and listen to them while they talk. Again, still nodding, gesturing, breathing as you go through it. So that idea of gesturing while you're standing still, low breathing, sort of mentioned the idea of the pause. It's kind of it's an obvious one, and that is that when a person is starting to talk, you can't say anything. You just have to wait. And just because they come to an end of a phrase and they inhale to finish the rest of their thought, during that inhalation, sometimes people will interrupt. So we really have to have some discipline behind our patterns so that when that person's idea is coming out, even if they have to breathe, even if they have to pause, even if they have time to think, that you continue to not speak, stand still, gesture, nod, so that they finish their thought as much as they would like to. A suggestion after somebody does say something like that is to have something for you that's authentic, that's genuine, and non-judgmental. What we mean by that is to not say something like, that's a great idea, or that's wonderful, what a fantastic question. Those affirmations, although heartfelt, can impact negatively group dynamics. Because if you say great question to somebody, and then another person asks a question and you don't say great question, then that person, and perhaps all their friends and associates, may think, that question wasn't worth it. So we want to be mindful of the idea when we're listening to a person and we're getting ready to acknowledge, to respond to them, that when we listen to and acknowledge, when they are finished, we say something that's neutral. We'll often use the pattern of thank you and say it in a way, with a hand coming out, thank you, followed by and. So it's thank you, and as we think about, and then you get into the piece. We're separating the responding part to the listening and acknowledging, because listening and acknowledging really is separate. It's about that person over there, listening to them. So that's the stand still, pause, breathe, gesture, all of that sort of stuff, followed finally by thank you. Or you find the word that works for you, that's neutral, non-judgmental, that you can use when people are providing input, asking questions when you're working with them. So that's the listening to and acknowledging part. Now we're going to go into the responding part. And in the responding part, what you can think about is, first off, location. And the idea that there are many locations that you work from, so there might be a presentation location or a getting attention location. You might have a location somewhere in the room where you offer maybe the management of the facility, where the restrooms are, what time you're going to start, what time you're going to leave. You might have another place in the room where you deal with particular problems or something of that, or you manage the group. The idea is that you want to have a location where you provide content. You also want to have a location where you're going to respond to questions. And we suggest that responding to questions maybe shouldn't be where you deliver content. Because if you deliver a response from where you deliver content and the response is not perceived well by the group, it can impact your credibility in a negative way. So when somebody raises their hand, starts talking, asks a question, and you're going to listen to and acknowledge, you do stand still, pause and listen in a new location, and then you respond from there also. If it's a particularly difficult question, one where you have to think about changing location. So as they say that and you say, thank you, and then you provide the answer here, several things occur. Number one is you pause. Number two is you breathe. And number three, by breathing, you increase the blood flow in your brain. You give yourself a chance to think. And the other is that pause in the room lets people think about that question and perhaps their own answers. And then when you move, when you then turn and stop moving again, that's a nonverbal signal to the group that you're ready to respond. So you have a location of response. So as you think about yourself in a room, working with people, have a content location, have a question location, have a response location. You don't tell people that. What you do is you simply do those things in those locations. By repeating the nonverbal pattern several times, the group will have it normed as an expectation, and then you are free to engage in interacting with the group. The other thing you can think about with this idea of listening to, and now we're on the acknowledging responding piece, is that when you respond, you want to look and see how the group's attending. What is the group's reaction? Do they continue to breathe? Is there fluidity? Do they stop breathing, freeze, and don't move? Do they laugh, roll their eyes, make noise? Whatever those things are, those all are responses to your response. And those are indicators of the group dynamics. And again, in longer sessions, we get deeply into that idea of what we do when groups are comfortable, rigid, not fluid, when they make noises, all those responses for group dynamics. The idea is that as we stand back and we respond to that person, that we're also looking not just at that person, we are peripherally perhaps looking at the group to see what their reactions are. Because that's consistent with the idea that our primary responsibility is the safety of the group so they can learn. It's that relaxed alertness. So those are the patterns that make up the responding to participants right after the listen to and acknowledge. So we're on the 7th essential ability, the last one. And it's called recovery with grace. And it's called recovery with grace because none of us are perfect, and all of us have done things in front of groups we wished we hadn't done. Perhaps we started a sentence that we didn't want to start. Perhaps we responded to a question and the response fell so flat that our credibility just went out the door. Or we attempted humor, no one laughed. Whatever it is, there are times that we do things, the group does not give us a nonverbal response we want, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. So it's at that time that we want to recover with grace. And so recovery with grace is about changing patterns. And patterns are important because as we've gone through these 6 essential abilities and we're looking at this last one, recover with grace, one of the overarching ideas that is important in looking at these patterns is that our brain detects patterns. That's what it does. It does many other things. One of the things it does is it detects patterns, recognizes them, and it pays attention when patterns shift. It's all biology. Oh.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Pays attention when pattern shift. I was trying to find a good pause while my throat was like tickling me more and more. Sorry.
It's all right. Do you need a bodily fluid? No, you're okay?
I need water fluid? Somebody to choose from.
Let me think back where I was. So I had just said, I think there's a pause in there somewhere.
Yeah, I stopped it at a pause.
What did I say? Do you remember what I said?
Oh, I just told you before I cut.
I know.
So, 7 essential.
Oh, patterns. Okay. Our brain does many things. One of the things that it does is it recognizes patterns. And in addition, not does it just recognize patterns, it recognizes very quickly shifts in patterns. And then it responds to the shift. And the idea, it's all biology. It's the idea that when patterns are the same, there isn't really a perceived threat. Go back to the grasses that are blowing in the winds. If we're out in the savannas and you're out in a field and the grasses are just simply waving in the winds, our brain recognizes a pattern, and if the pattern stays the same, it's safe. And as soon as that pattern shifts, as soon as something pops up like that, that's a shift in a pattern, then the brain starts paying attention. And that attention and then decides, what do I do? It's a threat. Well, the idea in recovery with grace is that you're up there doing something and somehow the pattern's disturbed. You start a sentence you wish you didn't start, you answer a question inappropriately, you tell a joke that falls flat, all those things I mentioned previously. So how do we get a group to sort of forget, have amnesia, that whatever happened, and redirect the whole thing so you can get your credibility back and just have people forget whatever occurred? It's a very quick move with this idea of recovery with grace, and there's a few patterns to use. The overarching idea along that idea of patterns is whatever patterns you did where you stepped in it, where you did what you wished you didn't do, you're going to change every pattern in a different location. So recovery with grace has this idea of changing location, the idea of interrupting yourself, which we'll get to in just a moment, and then decontaminating, leaving that space and creating that state of amnesia. So it might look like this. I'm going to interrupt myself, and I'm going to do it in a way that is extremely obvious right now. And the reason to do this is to model the idea of a recovery with grace. And in this case, it's starting a sentence I wished I hadn't started. So as you think about... as you think about some of the ways that we can influence people when we talk. So that's an example. We had a voice tone, we had a gesture with my right hand over here. You stop, as soon as your brain knows you're not going to use that sentence, just stop. Pause, change, pop up with a new voice, a new gesture, a new way of talking. And when we do that, people forget what was done before. It's completely changing the pattern. It's that idea of having a riff of your own so you know your own range and intensity of these patterns. So at any time, you can decide which one you'd like to use and how you would like to use it. So that's an example of this recovery with grace. Now throw in your personality. You can always be humorous. You can always do things like start a sentence you wish you hadn't started. And when you start... And I would never have said that. One of the ways I'd like to say, make fun, right? Make fun, self-deprecate as an idea. If it fits your personality, go for it. It's that idea that we just simply want to change as many patterns as possible. The huge one is location. And when we change location, we can't talk from the original location to the new location. So that whatever we do, there's silence between those two locations. Lastly, the piece to bring up along the idea of decontamination is when it happens to be particularly negative. So for instance, let's say you were writing on a chart and you wrote an answer or information on the chart and the group didn't like it. Or you were standing in a certain place in a room and you answered a question and the group just would not accept it. Then what we need to do is we need to decontaminate. We need to decontaminate that area, and we probably can't go back. So one of the things as somebody running a meeting, doing a workshop is always have more than one easel. Have 2 or 3. Part of the reason is when you use that one easel, you never know if something's going to get on that easel that the group doesn't like and we need to decontaminate. So you can literally pick up that easel and move it away. Take it out of the picture. Go to your new easel and work from that completely differently than you worked at from that easel. That's that idea of decontamination. Or if we're in a particular location in the room and we give an answer and people just flat out disagree, they're even vocal about it. No, that's not right. Whatever it is. Leave that location and don't go back. Decontaminate. Completely change it. Those are the things that Recovery with Grace centers around to help the group be safe. To let the group know that it's okay for whatever happened. You create the amnesia and you never make the group wrong. It's that idea of always having the group in your mind, their safety is primary. And Recovery with Grace and those patterns of changing location, stopping, interrupting yourself, decontaminating that location, those contribute to that idea of recovering with grace. So you have just explored the 7 essential abilities. And in this time, we didn't look at 55 patterns, but we probably looked about 20, 25 patterns. And as you think about yourself and think about what you would like to learn, what you would like to master, pick something. And as my mentor, Michael Grender, talked about when I first saw this work, he said to just pick a skill a week. So if there's something that you found that was intriguing you'd like to master, increase your consciousness of and your craftsmanship of implementation. Write yourself a little note, keep it with your books, keep it wherever it is that you're working. As a reminder, a visual reminder, pause, third point, frozen gesture, whatever it is, and practice it for a week. And within a few weeks or a few months, 12, 15 weeks later, you have mastery of these patterns as you go through. you will find that it most likely will increase the positive nature of the work that you do with the people you work with, getting them to learn new things, new skills and abilities, and at the same time, being open and receptive to things that would challenge their beliefs and values about the work they do, so that you can bring those together and really get people to work in ways they hadn't worked before. Wouldn't that be nice? So that's the choreography of presenting, the 7 essential abilities. Enjoy and practice.